JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a show about a bunch of buff 16-year-olds fighting perverted gorillas and psychopathic adults. Now imagine JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as a kid's show about comic book heroes fighting other comic book heroes. Now imagine the people using those comic book heroes to fight can also take the other person's hero and use them. Now imagine the show took inspiration from Miraculous Ladybug by including a love interest and school plots. Mixing all that together, you get Hero Inside.
Come on in.
It's a show that I found on Max while looking for things to watch, and honestly, I was surprised enough that I wanted to make a video about it. But when doing some research on the show, I could barely find anything. All I got is that the show is a South Korean, Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese joint production made by a South Korean studio called Million Volt Animation. It was also produced and likely funded by Tencent Video, which is just a small branch of a massive Chinese media company estimated to be worth over $400 billion. And while Tencent Media is responsible for the production of shows such as Arcane,
I won't hesitate, bitch!
Archer,
Grill me a cheese.
Comey Can't Communicate, and literally dozens more, I really couldn't find any other shows or media produced by Million Volt Animation outside of a YouTube series called Sea-Look. It's apparently super popular, and I can see why. Those seals are just adorable. Zhu Gongming, man, I hope I'm saying that right, is also only really known for directing the Larva Island movie. You know, that movie that's based on the popular Larva characters. All in all, it's a very new show made by a studio and producer that hasn't really done a lot, funded by a company that owns pretty much all of China's original media at this point. Aside from the details on the show's production, the voice cast is fairly small with some experienced English dub voice actors. You've got Mark Thompson, who has been in pretty much every American animated show and pilot under the sun, Samantha Cooper, and even Tom Wayland from the titular Super Smash Bros. Games. Post-editing Staxlotl here, I thought he was actually the announcer for Super Smash Bros., but he's just Keldeo. I don't know why it's funny post-editing, but yeah, he's definitely not the announcer, he's just a Pokemon. That being said, the voice acting isn't great, but they still do a solid job. Mark Thompson really sells it as Durko, but absolutely dropped the ball with Mike, the main character. He just sounds like someone trying to do an English dub Deku voice.
I'm not gonna let anyone get in my way! I'm a failure. After all that hard work. I'm sorry, All Might.
Want some eggplant parm?
But what exactly is Hero Inside? Well, it's a show about people with the ability to summon comic book heroes to do their bidding. Mike, the main character, ends up paying, Jesus, $40 for a comic.
That's a lot of money.
The comic book industry must be super lucrative in this universe. But when he pays the $40 for a comic, he manages to haggle in a free comic with it, and that comic book is Crying Man. So he takes the comic to his house, sits on the toilet, reads the comic, and eventually, Crying Man appears out of the comic. And that's basically where the story starts. Crying Man eventually explains to Mike that only people with enough imagination can bring comic book characters to life, using their imagination as energy to keep them out. If the user runs out of energy, they pass out. I mean, I can kind of understand the reasoning. In JoJo's, they would just die, and I don't think that would really be appropriate for a kid's show. Mike ends up using Crying Man to water his lawn, as well as drink his tears. I know this is a cartoon, but that kid is literally drinking a grown man's tears. That is disgusting. He's later convinced by his friend Nick to use Crying Man to become a famous hero, to which Crying Man's sad sense goes off and they rush to find a burning building. Some kid is trapped inside, so they go in to save the kid, and that's where they find the Dark Knight. Oh, sorry, it's Black Knight. But you know, it's very obviously a Batman parody. And this is basically where we're introduced to Durko and the plot about all of the comic books. It's actually quite interesting because I really wanted to know more about who was taking the comics, who made the comics, and they kind of try to discuss that while leaving some air of mystery. The show ends up basically being about Mike exploring the town and finding other comic book readers, collecting their comic books, and then running into what essentially is the main antagonists of the show, which is X and Durko. I really don't have too much to say on X because it's basically kind of like the masked anti-hero of the show, but Durko, man, Durko is just great. He's a great character. He kind of reminds me of those people living under their mom's basement shut-ins that are somewhat resembling the comic book nerds of The Simpsons and Fanboy and Chum Chum. And the voice work and character design of this character just really blew it away because he is by far the funniest character in the show.
This is a one-of-a-kind collectible, and you made me take it out of the box! Then we'll see who the real losers are! Huh? Oh, oops. Hang on, that chair gets stuck.
All of his expressions and all of his mannerisms just really carries everything in the show. The Black Knight is also pretty funny. I think he's probably the second funniest character in the show.
Are you scared?
What? No, me? I don't get scared. Please, hurry! I'm totally a tough guy, like always. Help! Save us! Yeah, and this is all standard hero stuff, by the way. I do it all the time.
Simply because of all of the physical humor he gets into. Him just spinning his head around in a 180 turn is just very hilarious to me for some reason. Honestly, Mark Thompson really blew it out of the water with both Durko and Black Knight, but come on. Mark is just such an awful character. Or, sorry, I meant Mike. Mike is such an awful character in the show. His voice is just bad. Speaking of bad, the intro and the outro of this show are pretty bad. I feel like they kind of just took the original Korean music and Google translated it once and said, okay, here you go. Here's the theme for the show. And honestly, it's terrible. The intro is kind of like what you would hear an American parody of a Japanese theme song. And then the outro is just kind of talking about getting up in the morning and going to school. I don't know, it just kind of doesn't sit right with me. The hero designs in the show are pretty hit or miss. I mean, Mummy Girl and Black Knight are obviously one of the better ones. And Gravity, I can't forget him. He's probably my favorite hero design with how his suit changes depending on how he's using his power. And then you have characters like the Boogie Duo, who are basically just like two 80s disco dancers whose power is to make people dance. And they only appear once in the show and then never again because they're so useless. The costume designs of the superheroes also aren't anything to write home about, but that's also kind of explained in the story of the show because basically the writer of the comic books worked with his 3-year-old niece to design these characters. So it's okay for their powers to be kind of childish and designs to be fairly simple. Well, if the character designs are pretty bad, the music is terrible, and the voice acting is mediocre at best, then what exactly is causing me to enjoy the show? Well, to put it short, it's the comedy. Yeah, sure, sometimes the jokes are pretty childish and do miss sometimes, but the ones that land are often pretty funny. The Black Knight screaming for help and then telling a child it's gonna be okay while they're sitting there in a burning building is very funny. And the fact that when he uses his comicalize ability, I swear he's actually pinching his nipples and screaming to get the owls to come. Then you have Durko's facial expressions, and the whole lightsaber collectible bit was just the best joke in the show. There's even an episode that's just dedicated to people who aren't part of the main story who have comic book powers, and it's easily my favorite episode of the series. Simply because you have one bit where it's an old lady bringing out this super justice man. And he's like, oh, is there crime I need to fight? Like, what's going on? How can I help you, young lady? And the old lady's just like, please, can you water my flowers and fight off these raccoons? And he does it because because he has to. He's like the summoned of the old lady. And then there's another scene in the episode where this kid, he's playing a video game and he dies in the video game. He gets mad and he goes off. He ends up going to this place that's very obviously being robbed, and these guys are loading up this truck full of money and they're armed. And he brings out this hero and just beats them all up. And one of the guys is like, "Why are you doing this?" And the kid just goes up to him and he's like, "Are you Noob Stomper, whatever?" And he's like, "Yeah, this is what you get for spawn camping." And then he walks away. Like, the dude stopped an armed robbery with a giant gelatin monster, and it was just the best thing. There's a real charm to it, and it more than makes up for its flaws in its voice acting and music, because man, is the music bad. Ultimately, it's a solid show with a lot of potential. If the cast can improve its voice acting, and if the music can get a bit of a tune-up with its translation, Hero Inside could be a really solid show. Tell me what you think in the comments. Am I crazy for liking this weird South Korean, Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese show? Or is this a hidden gem? All I can say for sure is I hope there's a second season.